Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's event. My name is Ben Ryan. I'm the Head of Research at Theos. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all to St. Mary's, Putney. This is a wonderful historic church, which, if you don't know, was the home of the 1647 Putney debates, an ambitious attempt to form a new constitution for England. So only a small amount of pressure on our panel to follow in that example. But a wonderfully appropriate place to be holding a series of events about the nature of state, society, and the common good. This is the third in that series. If you'd like to watch previous ones in the series, there was one on immigration and there was one on the family. Those videos are on the Theos website. This event this evening is also being filmed. So if you like what you hear, even if you don't like what you hear, and would like to share that with other people, the video will be up on our site in the next few days. This is a partnership between Theos, a think tank which looks to stimulate debate about religion and society through research, events, and comment, Together for the Common Good, a charity which is looking to build bonds and social trust and put common good principles into practice, and the Benedict XVI Centre at St. Mary's University, Twickenham, a research hub which is doing research on religion and public life. And we're so fortunate, and we really want to thank CCLA for their sponsorship for these events, for the videoing, and also for the reception, which we hope you'll join us for afterwards. CCLA is one of the UK's leading ethical fund managers with investments for more than 40,000 charities, churches, and public sector organisations, and they're the largest manager of socially responsible funds in the UK. And with that, that's enough by way of welcome. Please can I introduce Elizabeth Oldfield. Elizabeth is the director of Theos, and she'll be chairing the event this evening.
Thank you, Ben, and thank you so much all for coming. We hope tonight will be a chance to think a bit more deeply and a bit of a longer view of our future than perhaps we've had over the last few days. Because as you've heard, tonight is about the state, which we do still have one of, thankfully, at the moment, the church and community. It goes without saying that we live in a time of rapid change. And much of that change has been for the good, but there are also very deep crises of meaning and belonging. The old forms of establishment politics and indeed establishment church leadership are changing before our eyes, and it often can feel like more extreme voices are gaining traction. Brexit is just one of the many expressions of deeper upheavals underway, both here and globally. So as far as possible, we do want to be discussing that bigger picture of what is changing and why in those relationships between state, between church and community, and between all of us. Reflect on them and think about what might be a healthier, better way forward. We're going to hear from our eminent panel to help us get thinking about that. And they've been asked to talk for a few minutes about what they think lies behind these changes and what should the future hold. And in particular, if the forging of a renewed settlement between us is the great task of our time, how can people across the religious communities respond, and what might religious thought be able to contribute? What might it be able to offer as a resource for the wider flourishing of societies? So they've got a maximum of 8 minutes each. They're aiming for 7. And I have warned that I'm going to apply some gentle nudge technique of social shaming, that I will hand them a timer that will go off, that you will be able to hear if they go over 8 minutes. And that's both just mean, but also because we really want to protect that time to hear from you as the audience, to engage in a proper conversation, ideally between you as well as between you and the panel, because there is wisdom and experience in this room across the board, not just up here at this table. I've also warned them that I am going to sound a metaphorical jargon klaxon if I hear a word that I feel is not in common usage, whether that's a political acronym, a government term, a theological term, or any other thing that I think someone in the room might feel excluded because they don't understand it. I will ask our panelists to unpack it. And we will see who manages to avoid my Professor Umbridge-style interruptions. So with no further ado, I'm going to briefly introduce them. These are very eminent panelists, and you can look up the whole long list of their CV for themselves. So I'll just name a few things. We're going to start with Jenny Sinclair, who is the founder and the director of Together for the Common Good, which is a charity working to strengthen the bonds of social trust to achieve mutual flourishing. Then we'll hear from John Milbank, who is an Anglican theologian, philosopher, poet, and political theorist. He's written extremely widely. Most recently, he's the co-author of The Politics of Virtue, Post-Liberalism and the Human Future. To my left, we have Mike Royal, who's co-chief executive of the Cinnamon Network UK, which is a charity helping churches with their community engagement. They do really fascinating work in a range of areas, and he's also a Pentecostal bishop. And finally, right at the end, we've got Maurice Glasman, who is a political theorist and a Labour life peer in the House of Lords. Lord Glasman is director of the Common Good Foundation and the founder of Blue Labour. With that, I'm going to hand over to Jenny for our first contribution.
Thank you, Liz. So we are where we are, and we're trying to keep this space free of Brexit ins and outs. We can touch on that later in the Q&A. So I want to pull back and have a look at a bigger picture and try to get through the noise. And I think it's important that if churches are going to make a constructive contribution as we go forward through these times of upheaval, we've got to be clear about what are the drivers, the causes behind where we are. Because we're seeing people turning inward, we're seeing a breakdown in social trust, but it's been a long time in the making. And really it's to do with decades of individualism, the individualistic society, which perhaps was a good response to what was happening in the 50s. It was necessary perhaps in the 60s, but it's gone too far. And we've seen extreme individualism on the right in terms of the way the economic system has been captured by neoliberalism, and we've seen it on the left as well as kind of social individualism, the me culture. So I think there's this bit, also this great de-alignment that's happening between the governed and those who govern us. And these fault lines that have come up over the last, say, 20 years at least, are now values divides. This is why our current political system is struggling to cope, because it's no longer really about left and right. It's about people struggling to catch up with culture change. And this kind of individualism over these years has, I think, led to three overlapping crises. A crisis of social solidarity. We're seeing rising in loneliness, in suspicion. People are less willing to engage with people unlike themselves. We're seeing a crisis of alienation. Lower trust in institutions, a disconnect between the governed and the governed, a crisis of purpose, meaning. People have a sense of nothing matters. We're seeing rises in addiction, depression, suicide, all those kind of measures. All these have come from a kind of culture of individualism that's infected our life together, and it's driving us apart. And I think that the churches actually have a potential here to overcome the sort of binaries that we're seeing dividing the West, the sort of binaries that we see between old and young, urban and rural, left and right, conservative and liberal, anywheres, somewheres, the so-called open-closed divide, all these kind of polarizations. And the reason I think that the churches have the potential to overcome this, or at least to transcend it, is because we ourselves cover all those divides. The churches, who are the churches? They're us, they're people. We are more than our hierarchies, we're more than our institutions. And I think that we have the potential, if we play our cards right and we're constructive, to help to build a renewed sense of community, to balance that sense of crisis in individualism. And we would talk about the common good as an antidote. And we define it in a particular way. We say it's the shared life of a society in which everyone can flourish. But it's generated as we act together in different ways that all contribute towards that goal. And it's enabled by social conditions that mean everyone can participate. And it requires us to participate. It requires us to take responsibility. So the common good is not a utopian ideal, it's something that exists between us, particularly when people come together across difference. So the common good is very different from community cohesion, which is a kind of government speak. Common good is about encounter between human beings. And there's something about our tradition, our Christian tradition, that understands the true nature of the human person. which is transcendent. And so that puts us in a slightly different category. And I think, frankly, more is expected of us, especially to be non-tribal. There's a great temptation now for people to take tribal positions. And I think that's something we really have to refuse. And I think that's quite a challenge. I think a lot of people in the churches actually are tribal. And even, sadly, within our own spectrum of traditions, we have a lot of tribalism going on. So I think there's a sense of examination of conscience that needs to go on there. The church, when it's really at its best, and after all, what I think most people, including the unchurched, expect it to be, is to be authentically itself, not to try to be like mainstream society, but also to be welcoming and to offer a sense of family, a sense of belonging to something that transcends the two-dimensional nature of everyday life. And I think there is actually an appetite for optimism. People are desperate for a vision, which seems to be very lacking from our politicians, who I think understandably are getting very bogged down. But I think when I've heard some of the churches say, we're going to have 5 days of prayer, or, that's our response. Yes, of course, that's our bedrock. That's how we start. Prayer is our cornerstone. But the question is, what do we do then? How do we respond? And action is important. So I think one of the first things is to say, are we really in touch with our own country? How well do we know other parts of our country? We're all living in tiny slivers of our society, and we rarely step outside those. So I think we need to take an intentional step to meet people who we don't know, and perhaps even to get on a train and go to another part of the country that we don't know. And I think that our denominations, our different traditions, bring so many different gifts to the table here. And part of what we do at Together for the Common Good is we try to cross-fertilize, and there's no syncretism, no sense of dumbing down our traditions. We're strong in our traditions, but I think there are mutual gifts between the Pentecostals, the Anglicans, the Catholics, Methodists, Charismatics, so on, that we can be more effective when we work together, when we collaborate. And I think there's also a role for reconciliation here, but I think we need to be careful. There's quite a lot of talk about reconciliation in the churches, and we need to be very mindful that it's not actually a kind of attempt at re-education in a Trojan horse, as it were. When we talk about reconciliation, it really means respecting the other person's opinion and treating them in the integrity of their human nature, and recognizing that intelligent people come to different conclusions. So I think having a one-to-one conversation at least once a week in some depth with someone that we know we disagree with is really important. And we also need to reclaim the ground that's being claimed by extremists. So we can't let the far right, for example, claim patriotism. We have to reclaim a language of national community, which is something that everyone can buy into. So we need to be brave, we need to be courageous, and I think we need to be humble. The sense of a humble church, a church of humility, where we recognize our own failings, but our sense of rootedness geographically, we're local, national, regional, international. We can build bonds between communities that are estranged, between people that are estranged. And I think that's a really important contribution that we can make.
Thank you. Jenny, thank you. And straight over to you, John.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, I entirely agree with absolutely everything that Jenny has said, but I'll try and make some remarks that will stand as a footnote to what she's been saying. Perhaps the biggest issue that Christians faced in relation to politics at the moment is that we've got this division between liberal globalizers on the one hand and increasing national populism on the other. And a lot of that national populism is sometimes taking a form of something that's near to religious fascism. It's often sort of corralling religion in the service of national identity. And so what I think very, very strongly is that Christians shouldn't be on either the one side or the other, that they need to very much offer precisely what Jenny has talked about, a third way. Now, what I want to suggest to you is that if you think that the churches and religion is on the margins of all this, that might be completely wrong. Increasingly, historians seem to be arguing that, in fact, Christianity went on playing an enormously important political role in the 20th century. And I think the significance of that is that in some ways we do now seem to be seeing a kind of rerun of the 1930s. Nothing's ever, exactly the same. But in the 1930s, you had a standoff between liberalism and fascism. And of course, communism was more of a player. Now it seems to be more, the standoff you're seeing between liberalism and populism seems somewhat to echo the 1930s. Now, during the 1930s, Christians in this country and in France, but Germany, articulated a very powerful alternative, which was often significantly associated with the term Christendom, by which they meant simply that Christianity should be a whole way of life. It should be, if you like, a whole politics. And they tried to offer very much a third way, which was to do with the primacy of association, not the primacy of the isolated individual, not the primacy of the state, not a cult of the nation, but the primacy of the dignity of the person, relations between people, and the way these extend across national boundaries, with national, regional, local identities respected, but looking for much more than that. Now, what historians are increasingly insisting is that the settlements after 1945 were not just secular settlements. In many ways, this was the last set of big Christian settlements, that theologians were massively involved in the UN Declaration of Human Rights, in the formation of what eventually became the European Union, in this country, in the setting up of the welfare state. To some degree, this was actually an Anglican achievement, as is increasingly recognized. So the question for Christians is, you've got this post-war settlement, which in some ways is extraordinarily successful. It produces, at least to a degree, a certain amount of peace. It brings about a welfare state. It brings about a kind of tempered capitalism, if you like. And it recognizes human rights, but it also stresses dignity and relationship. And it seems that over a long period of time, that has totally broken apart. So in some ways, from a Christian point of view, what you need to ask is what we're living through now the result of a complete sort of secular rejection of the last Christian order? But also, are Christians culpable in this? Increasingly, people are saying, that the retreat from the Christendom theme, the increased sort of baptizing of merely liberalism and democracy that you got, especially from the South Bank theologians, for example, in Britain, was not, as they thought, a kind of acceptance.
Do you explain who the South Bank theologians are?
Okay, people like John T. Robertson, honest to God, in the early 60s, people talking about the death of God, people saying that actually secularization is human beings growing up and it's all completely fine. And what people are now saying is that actually it's not true that Britain was secularized at that point. An awful lot of people were still going to church. Church going was increasing in the 1950s. It's much more as if these theologians helped to bring about part of the 60s in this country. I think Jenny is right. Good things happened through the 60s, but we do need to ask whether that started to inaugurate an over-individualism. And so since then, you've had cultural liberalism on the left, economic liberalism on the right. Maybe it's too embarrassing to embrace these two things both at once, but increasingly, I think what we're seeing is that they're converging, but now there's a huge reaction against it. And the trouble is that if you know, there's a sort of populist gut feeling, like with the Gilets jaunes in France, that this kind of metropolitan liberalism, which is marginalizing most people, not just economically, but also culturally, it can't quite be right, and sort of not caring about local identities and you know, the thick traditions of local France. But the trouble is, if you've sort of lost a religious transcendent vision, this tends to take, I think, a very atavistic form. And so for that reason, I think it's very important in this circumstance that the church reasserts boldly that you need a transcendent vision. You need things like believing in the soul, the primacy of relationship. These things really matter. And what can that mean in practice? Well, I think there's a sense in which only religion offers an alternative to nationalism versus internationalism. It gives a sort of thicker sense of a shared international, global identity. I also think churches have a very important role to play, as Archbishop Welby is completely right about this, in creating new forms of embedded economy, new forms of mutualist, associative practice. And finally, I think that the church needs to play a much bigger role in shaping new forms of virtuous leadership. Because although I think we do need more democracy and more participation, I think you can't ever abolish the need for leadership in every level of society. And the trouble is, if you don't train people properly in this, they will always subvert, you know, the democratic system. They will always use it to their own ends. And democracy also needs people to put forward good proposals that we're going to vote on in the first place. So I think the churches have an enormous role to play in trying to train better leadership, better cadres, if you like, you know, not technocratic elites, but truly wise elites.
Thank you very much, John. Over to you, Mike.
Thank you. The state, the church, and the community. This debate could not be more timely. First of all, let's look at the state. Like a good preacher, I've got 3 points under each part. You'd expect that from a Pentecostal bishop. What we see in our state and in our nation is a polarization between the hard right and the hard left, between populist positions. And what we see from our politicians is more time being spent defending those positions than actually defending the impact that their decisions are having on the people that they were elected to serve. And I think as a church leader, as a charity leader, I am trying to learn the importance of keeping an independent voice that can speak above the noise. And I think there's a challenge for the church not to follow the populist gravy train, but to be a prophetic voice that can speak and cut through that noise. So the relationship between the church and the state. Well, the church and the parachurch, for want of a better phrase, I believe has got to be in this moment a critical friend, willing to call out poor policy when we see it, and particularly when we see it impacting ordinary people in everyday society. I see it every day in the city that I live and love in, and love, Birmingham, but it's here in London and towns and cities across the UK. And we can never allow funding or our own vested interests to mute our voices. And there's a challenge for all of us. We've got to keep on asking the question, where are the pinch points? Looking at the issue of holiday hunger, we, as in Cinema Network, work with organisations that are partnering with churches and scaling projects that can look to address the issue of holiday hunger, children who during the holidays do not have a warm meal in their stomachs. And actually the church can step in and do something. elderly people who are suffering isolation. Think of a great project, Care Home Friends. Simply asking the church to go and visit your local care home and visit elderly people who may be isolated. Issue of youth violence on our street. Think of the work of Stephen Addison, Box Up Crime, seeking to set up boxing clubs in a church so that actually disengaged young people have got something to engage. So some people might say, or even a few years ago, we might have said, well, should the church be doing that? Isn't that surely the job of the state? We are way past that point now. We have, as a church, to be there for when the state has failed. And we've seen it on several occasions, over several themes. The Windrush scandal, the rollout of universal credit, the homelessness crisis that's affecting our large cities. We can no longer assume that chronic state failure cannot happen in Western democracies. It's happened in Greece, it's happened in other places in Europe, and actually it is happening right here in the UK and has already happened for many in our community. And so finally, the church and the community. I think firstly the church needs to be a solicitor in the community or an advocate, someone who is supporting people on the journey. Cinema Network is just committed to pulling up a chair alongside church leaders and church activists, helping them think carefully and intelligently about how they engage on the ground and how that church meets people at the point of their needs and journeys with them. But I also think that the church really needs more than ever to be a place of sanctuary. Not just a place of welcome, not just a place where the doors are open and people can have a cup of tea, but a place where people can find shelter and safety and know that the church is not going to fail them and is not going to let them down. The thing is, I realise about all the different projects that are going on in our communities, meeting all the different needs, but the thing that strikes me about all of them that they have in common is simply this: relationships, relationships, relationships. And we have got to get back to relating and journeying with people. Finally, I feel on this area that the church needs to be in solidarity with the last, with the least, and with the lost. The last, the communities who feel left behind right now, feel forgotten. The least, the most vulnerable in society. The young, the elderly, the homeless, the refugee, and the lost, our young people, a whole generation of young people who have been led astray into gangs and have completely lost their way through no fault of their own. In this moment, many will be wringing their hands. What shall we do next? While others will just walk by on the other side. I'm all right, mate. But I think the church is called to be the hands and the feet of Jesus in our community. I want to finish with an ironic statement, and it draws on what's already been said by my eminent colleagues. We're here tonight in thinking space and in debating space. And in a Western context, the emphasis is very much on thinking. I think, therefore I am. I think John just described that very well. But I'm someone of African Caribbean descent, and I love that African phrase, Ubuntu, which isn't I think, therefore I am. I am because we are. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you and good evening. And I'm really very kind of moved and honoured to be here. It's obviously I was brought up in North London, and so I never ever visited South London until I was 18, and that was only because I saw, do you remember there was a program called Nationwide, and they did a feature, you've got to forgive me because I was led astray, that you could buy drugs in South London and meet women, and I came once, and as with most things in my life, it didn't quite work out for me, but it's really wonderful to be here. I just want to say how really honoured I am to be with you, Mike, and with John, and with Jenny. I'll return to some of those themes about sanctuary, but just to say that I reiterate those views. But also for me, to be here in Putney, you know, where the Putney debates, there's the saying on the wall, for really I think that the poorest he that is in England hath a life to live as the greatest he. You could say she as well, I don't want to get involved in that. But I think that the Blue Labour is the only sort of ideology ever that reconciled Rainsborough with Archbishop Laud. You know, that's one very good way of understanding it. Archbishop Laud did resist enclosures, and he had his head chopped off, and that has to be honoured. And Rainsborough spoke up for liberty and democracy, and he also had his head chopped off. You know, what happened in Putney was vital, and what they were talking about in Putney is vital for us to retrieve and to live in, I think, because they spoke about a commonwealth. That was the concept that was involved. A commonwealth where essentially we've got to think that the wealth of the country was held in common. And this concept of the common good is, I think, really a vital one because it's there in our political culture. So we've got the common law, which is something that needs to be retrieved. There's, as many of you have noticed, we actually have a House of Commons. You know, it is a Commons. We've got the common good, and also what we're living through is the besieging of the commons. I really love this idea of a sanctuary. And a sanctuary is a place where you defy the worldly powers. That's how I understand it. The power of money and the actual domination. It's a place of non-domination, a sanctuary, and a space, and that is directly linked to, I think, the idea of the commons. So when we think about the state here in England, we've got a very peculiar state. You know, that's one thing that's true, I think, and neglected. So we maybe in 2 weeks' time will have a sovereign state again that can actually act. So it's a place of decision. But what's neglected in the state is that there's also a body politic, and this is where I think the Christian tradition is absolutely fundamental. And what do I mean by that is that if you look at two others who neither renounced Laud or Rainsborough, John, I don't know what you think, but I would say that Tawney reconciled them too. And his whole point was about incarnation, that we're embodied beings.
Just say who Tawney is.
Oh, Tawney was, he was a kind of guy who didn't really want to be an academic, but ended up as an academic. That's what he was an economic historian. He was a very good friend of Attlee and a very good friend of Temple. So this post-war settlement that John was talking about was completely infused with Christian thought. I don't think that can be, and they spoke about a commonwealth, and they spoke about the sharing of the burdens, and they also spoke about luck, you know, that some people are unlucky, and it's a mad thing to think that you can abolish luck, but you can mitigate against its disasters. So it was unbelievably, because we don't talk about it now, it was completely bounded by this idea of reciprocity, that you put in and you got out. It wasn't considered a right in any way. This was not embedded in rights theory, but was to give the polity some substance. So we're embodied beings and we're embedded beings. In other words, we're social beings in our nature. We're not, Jenny, I thought, spoke about this very well. We do not find our fulfillment outside of relationships, but in relationships. And that's another area where the retrieval of a Christian language of grace and a Christian land of fidelity is absolutely vital, because there could be good relationships and bad ones. We know this. There could be abusive relationships, and this whole concept of gaslighting is a really, really important one in our contemporary society, but also in our state. And this is a vital aspect of the body politic and the way that the church is so central to this, is that place is represented. So I put you on jargon alert. You are on real jargon alert now, because I'm going to talk.
You get away with gaslighting.
Yeah, because I'm going to gaslighting. I think I can get away with, because it kind of appeals to the young. But what I'm thinking about really is that we're confronted by a very inhumane power, which has dominated our political thought. So even when John said the third way, I immediately jolted and said, not that. Not that. By no means that. Because that was, in some ways, a very wicked theology in a fundamental way. Because what it said was, okay, jargon alert, telos. So what
by which you mean?
Exactly. By which I mean that there's a predetermined end to which we are bound. Progressives tend to call it, I just want to signal that the least true thing in politics that's ever been said is that things can only get better, right? So, and that's my definition of a progressive. They think there's an arc of history, and that people like me are really on the wrong side of history, and that's all that needs to be said. So let's just say that we understand, I hope, the fall, and we understand tragedy, and things don't necessarily get better at all. And what the third way was based on was that there's technology, that's called reality. There's a technological telos, and that is that because of the internet, place does not matter anymore. Relationships don't matter anymore. And so that there's a technology that transcends place, transcends borders, undermines tradition. So there's a technological, what's called jargon alert, technological determinism, that we can't, this is a fate that we have to accept. And it undermines all those things, relationships, place, tradition, and any form of solidarity, right? And that links up with the other features of globalization, which is, secondly, that there is no alternative to capitalism, and that capitalism is the best conceivable system. And we have to understand what that means when I say is that it's, now here's a big
you have 11 seconds.
Jargon word. Okay, I'll take 30 because the word's long.
Okay.
And that is commodification, right? And commodification means that something that wasn't produced for sale, let's say nature, or human beings, are in fact commodities that should be treated and moved around and exploited in that way. And the second aspect of this wicked third way theology is the idea that the state is there purely in terms of administration. It's an administrative state, that its democracy is bound. I've clocked it. And the third aspect is liberalism, by which I don't mean liberty, I mean the ideal of an individual emancipated from all obligation and relationship to others that is purely self-defining. These have all come together, so what I had more to say, including about sanctuary, but what I would say here is that there needs to be, that Christianity offers a language and it offers a tradition that is absolutely vital for restoring place, restoring the integrity of relationships, and conceptualizing what the common good could look like.
Thank you. And a big round of applause for our panelists.